Welcome back to my garden. During the week, I listened to listened to a podcast episode from Mark Manson. If you're not familiar with Mark Manson, he is the author of, amongst other books, The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck. An enormous international bestseller. Very often writers, the blurb will say New York Times bestseller, best-selling author. And frankly, it's a dubious sort of claim. But I think this is one of those books that sold millions and millions of copies, has been translated into dozens of languages. And so Mark Manson has become quite the success story. And his style is very irreverent, I suppose, and it plays heavily on shocking, strong language, use of shocking, strong language, hence the title, which has become, I'm saying he was the first, but I think a lot of people have tried to copy the recipe. Now, I like Mark Manson. I certainly like that book up to a point. I think the underlying philosophy, the thinking behind it is good. But after a while, the sort of shocking language, the sort of in-your-face expression of complex ideas starts to wear a little thin. It almost becomes, dare I say it, something of a self-parody. It becomes a little annoying. Okay, we got the joke, but it just keeps on carrying on. Perhaps I'm not his target market. I think that's possibly also worth saying. But I do, as I say, I do like his sort of brand of armchair philosophy that imparts stoicism, imparts advice for leading a better life, imparts Buddhism. He throws a lot of interesting stuff in there. And his guest this week was none other than Oliver Burkemann. And perhaps you've read his books. I've certainly spoken about them at length. A journalist who I suppose was most famous at The Guardian and has written a few books that are sort of anti-self-help, let's call it that. But the one that has gained the greatest international traction is, and that I've spoken about at some length on this channel, is 4,000 Weeks Time Management for Mortals, which is a sort of against very much what lies at the heart of much of contemporary self-improvement literature, much of the advice that we commonly hear about from YouTube self-improvement gurus, about how to improve your productivity, your effectiveness in life. So this was quite an interesting conversation. And at a certain point, Mark Manson, I suppose, to some degree, they obviously know each other from some time before the interview. They seem to genuinely get on quite well. And the fact that Oliver Burkemann is this very polite, self-effacing, very middle-class English sort of gentleman, very polite. He proved to be a fantastic dampener on the sort of worst excesses that make me kind of get a little irritated with Mark Manson sometimes. At a certain point, Mark Manson was talking about how often he visits Brazil. He tends to come to Brazil once or twice a year, and he lived here for some time. I don't think lived here for a long time like I did, but certainly lived here for some time. He had a sort of nomadic phase of his life. And they had been talking about how almost the part of the antidote, it seems, to much of toxic personal development advice is to just be more in the present. Just live your life, enjoy the moment, and that sort of thing. And Mark Manson was bringing up the point that, Brazil is a country that really does take that to heart. I mean, he's right to a fair amount, to a fair degree, but I must say that if you get around to watching this, that he does oversimplify and reduce Brazil to some rather limiting stereotypes. Essentially what he put forward is, but there's a problem, there's a price to pay. You live very much in the moment, joyfully, like people do in Brazil. And then you end up not getting anything done. Now, this is quite simply not true in Brazil. It's true that Brazil does not have the extraordinary economic muscle that the USA has. And it's true that people in Brazil are far removed in terms of how they view leisure time and the legendary 70-hour work week ethic. I mean, Brazil and America are on opposite ends of some sort of spectrum. And that is true. But the idea that Brazil doesn't get anything done, well, that's definitely not the case. But let us just kind of push the hyperbole to one side and say that to some degree Mark has a point. The point that he was trying to make with this sort of heavy-handed example that he was putting forward to Oliver Burkemann was that the price you pay for living in the moment is that perhaps you don't accomplish things that you would accomplish if you adopted a slightly more balanced approach to your life. And they kind of spoke around about the point, and a very interesting conversation. The sort of conclusion, I guess, the key takeaway is to view all this kind of productivity advice and drive for greater personal efficiencies and accomplishment. All the sorts of techniques that are put forward, to view them simply as tools and to use them when they help and to put them to one side when they don't. And they also sort of look at the other end of the spectrum, this idea of living in the moment, and they make the point that Buddhism, or Eastern philosophy, shall we say, there's a sort of stereotype of that you live in the moment, and it's as if you are just sitting in the lotus position, humming Om very loudly and doing nothing. And practitioners of Buddhism, monks for example, in Southeast Asia, that nothing could be further from the truth. They are busy people, and it seems that their life is built around doing things much of the time. Chores, sweeping and cooking and tidying and cleaning and helping people and maintaining the monastery and all of that sort of stuff, and being of service to people who visit there. So Buddhism is not about not being active, it's about being present. And it's almost like, in some strands of it, this takes the shape of being incredibly active. And I've spoken about that, the notion of meditation through washing the dishes, for example. And I found that quite, the whole conversation was quite a neat encapsulation, this sort of push-pull dynamic between being in the moment and working using sort of planning and efficiency techniques to be a more productive and more successful person. I think what I did, my sort of not counter-argument, but counterpoint that I would throw into that conversation that I was thinking about while I was listening to the podcast, is that I think the real problem on the other side of the coin is when people use the ordinary versus the extraordinary life, being present rather than being future goal orientated, being in the moment, when they use all those sorts of things as a very subtle form of what I also speak about a lot, this kind of Stephen Pressfield concept, resistance. The inner voice that sabotages you and the things you want to achieve. So we use this, well, I'm leading a nice, pleasant, normal life and I'm in the moment and I enjoy what I'm doing and I'm very happy, actually as a subtle way of avoiding doing things that we really do want to do. And I guess that's what I've been talking about over the last few episodes, weeks, months, that there's nothing at odds between leading this sort of maximal, extraordinary life and doing ordinary things. The same way that there is nothing at odds between leading a life where you are very much living in the moment and being active. And sometimes that requires you to pull away and take a moment to think strategically. But then you must be in that moment. You must be fully present in your strategizing. And you must have balance in that as much as you have, or balance with being active in your everyday tasks that you perform. And of course, I suppose this naturally leads towards the fact that today is, what are we, 24, 23, 22, the 21st of December, sorry, a little count back from Sunday's Christmas Eve. And then the week after that, it's New Year's Eve, and it's time for the much maligned, misunderstood, misused, abused activity, which is the New Year's resolution. But, this idea of being in the moment is not at odds with thinking towards the future and perhaps thinking ambitiously of what a extraordinary version of your life might be or amount to. So there we are. I would certainly encourage you to search out Mark Manson's podcast, The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck podcast, which is available in all the podcasting places, but also is on YouTube. And his conversation with Oliver Burkemann, even if you're not a Mark Manson fan, is worth a listen, I think. Anyway, that's it for this week. As always, let me know what you think. I trust your lives are filled with joy, and indeed will be filled with compliments of the season, however you might celebrate that this weekend. And until next week, when I have my last episode for 2023, ciao from sunny Brazil.